Welcome to the silent verdict.
With Clara Monroe and Elias Gray.
What happens when a marital argument takes a deadly detour, transforming a Georgia interstate into, well, a scene of unimaginable tragedy?
Yeah, this is one of those cases that really sticks with you. It's just a stark illustration, isn't it? How quickly a personal crisis can spiral, cascade into a public catastrophe.
Absolutely.
With just devastating consequences.
It forces you to think about, the boundaries between our private lives and the wider world, how fragile they can be.
So today we're doing a deep dive into a truly bizarre and just tragic incident. It happened in Douglas County, Georgia, back in January 2022.
That's right.
Picture this. Husband and wife driving on I-20. They're arguing.
Heated argument, yeah.
And then in just this moment of extreme, impulsivity, the husband jumps out of the moving car.
Jumps out. It's hard to fathom.
And what followed was this horrifying multi-vehicle pileup. The legal aftermath, well, the husband got convicted, multiple charges.
And a significant sentence.
20 years in prison, plus 4 years of probation afterwards. It's the kind of fact pattern, honestly, that you might see in a law school exam hypothetical. It's almost hard to believe it actually happened.
Right. Just unbelievable. So let's break down how this all unfolded.
Okay, so setting the scene. January 2022, I-20, Douglas County. You've got the husband and wife driving. An argument starts, gets heated.
And the wife is driving, right? How fast?
She was driving at approximately 80 miles per hour, so pretty fast.
80, okay.
And here's a really critical detail. Both of them were reportedly intoxicated. They'd been at some event in Atlanta.
Okay, so you've got high speed, an argument, and alcohol involved. That's a volatile mix right there.
Extremely volatile. And then comes this unbelievable act. The husband intentionally jumps out of the car while it's moving at 80 miles per hour.
Intentionally. He just opens the door and goes.
Lands in the middle of the interstate.
And somehow, incredibly, he survived that initial jump.
He survived. But like you said, that was far from the end of it.
No, not even close. What happened next?
Well, that's where the chain reaction begins. There was a van. It was carrying 5 people traveling down that same stretch of I-20.
Okay.
The driver sees this man suddenly lying in the road, instinctively, swerves to avoid hitting him.
The natural reaction, right, to avoid hitting someone.
Exactly. But that split-second decision, that swerve, led directly to a collision with a semi-truck.
Oh, no.
And the impact was, well, catastrophic.
Catastrophic is really the only word. What happened to the people in the van?
It was horrific. The van spun just violently. And in that chaos, 2 passengers were actually ejected from the vehicle.
Ejected. Onto the highway.
Onto the highway. One of them died right there at the scene.
Oh, awful. And the other...
The other person ejected miraculously survived without injury, apparently. It's hard to even comprehend.
Wow. Okay. But there were others inside.
Yes. Tragically, another passenger inside the van also died from the collision.
So 2 fatalities from the van.
2 fatalities. And a third passenger was severely injured. Life-altering injuries.
It's devastating. What about the driver of the van? The one who swerved?
The driver also suffered severe injuries. So severe, in fact, that they resulted in the amputation of a leg.
Oh, my goodness.
Just think about that. Trying to do the right thing, avoid hitting someone, and ending up with such a catastrophic outcome for yourself and your passengers.
And the truck driver.
The semi-truck driver somehow was not injured in all this.
Incredible. So after all this chaos, the husband who jumped, he's injured but alive. What happens to him?
Well, he received medical treatment for his injuries from the jump. But after that, he was arrested.
Arrested at the hospital or after treatment?
After treatment, following a grand jury indictment. They reviewed the evidence and decided there was enough to charge him formally.
Okay. But he wasn't the only one facing legal trouble, was he? The wife was driving, intoxicated.
That's right. She was also taken into custody. She later pleaded guilty to DUI, driving under the influence.
And what was her sentence?
She received 12 months of probation.
So probation for the DUI.
Yeah, so you have this one single impulsive, terrible act fueled by alcohol and anger leading to 2 separate criminal cases.
It's quite something. So let's dig into the husband's case more. The charges against him were serious.
Very serious. That 20-year sentence tells you that.
Okay, let's unpack the legal side then. What exactly were the key charges the prosecution brought against the husband?
The two main charges were involuntary manslaughter and reckless conduct.
Involuntary manslaughter. Okay, how does that apply here? He didn't, intend to kill anyone by jumping out, presumably.
Exactly. That's the involuntary part. In this context, it means causing someone's death unintentionally while doing something unlawful or criminally negligent. So the unlawful or negligent act here was arguably the incredibly reckless act of jumping from a car going 80 miles per hour on an interstate.
Right.
The prosecution didn't have to prove he wanted anyone to die, just that his actions were so reckless, so dangerous, that they directly led to the deaths.
Okay, so the focus is on the recklessness of the action itself, not the specific intent for the outcome. Makes sense. And what about reckless conduct? How's that defined legally?
Reckless conduct is basically acting with a conscious disregard, a willful disregard for the safety of others. I mean, think about it. Jumping out of a car at that speed on a busy highway.
Yeah, it's inherently dangerous, not just to yourself.
Exactly. It puts everyone else on that road at immense risk. The law sees that as demonstrating a clear indifference to whether you cause a catastrophe or not.
And this brings us to that legal idea of causation, right? Connecting the jump to the pileup. How did they establish that link legally?
Precisely. Causation is key. The prosecution had to draw a clear line, a direct causal link from point A, the husband jumping, to point B, the van swerving, hitting the truck, and the resulting deaths and injuries.
They had to show that but for his jump, the crash wouldn't have happened. At least not like that.
Essentially, yes. But for his reckless act, this specific chain of events wouldn't have been set in motion. And it's important to note, the wife's DUI, while obviously a factor in the initial situation, her being intoxicated while driving,
right,
that was treated as a separate legal issue. It didn't excuse or negate the husband's responsibility for the direct consequences of his act of jumping.
Okay, that clarifies the legal framework. So in court, what were the main arguments? What did the prosecution really hammer home?
Well, the prosecution's argument was pretty powerful and, frankly, quite direct. They called the husband's decision to jump out of that speeding car an act of absurd recklessness. That was the district attorney's phrase.
Absurd recklessness. Yeah, that sounds about right.
They really emphasized that this single, incredibly impulsive choice started an unavoidable chain reaction.
Right, the domino effect.
Exactly, a chain reaction that tragically killed people and severely injured others. They argued that harm was, if not intended, certainly foreseeable from such a dangerous act. Anyone should know jumping onto an interstate is incredibly dangerous.
It's hard to argue with that logic, seeing the outcome. What about the defense, though? Did they have any way to counter that? What might they have argued?
Well, the source doesn't spell out the defense strategy in detail, but we can definitely infer some possibilities. They likely argued that his actions were purely impulsive, maybe driven by the alcohol, the heat of the argument.
Like a moment of complete irrationality.
Perhaps, and that he absolutely did not intend for this horrific, widespread harm to occur. Trying to frame it as a rash act, incredibly dangerous, yes, but without the specific aim of causing a multi-car pileup and fatalities.
But as you said, with involuntary manslaughter, the intent isn't really the main point, is it? It's the recklessness.
That's the crux of it. The fact that he probably didn't foresee the full, terrible scope of the tragedy, well, that doesn't automatically get him off the hook. Legally, he's still responsible for the consequences flowing from his profoundly reckless behavior. The law holds you accountable for that level of disregard for safety.
Looking back at the whole sequence, it feels like a series of terrible turning points. What were the absolute key moments that sealed this tragic fate?
Oh, absolutely. Several critical points stand out. First and foremost, obviously, the husband's decision. Opening that door, jumping onto I-20 at 80 miles per hour, that's the catalyst.
The initial spark.
Definitely. Then the immediate reaction of the van driver. Swerving, trying to avoid hitting him. That was the next crucial link in the chain.
That evasive action.
Which led directly to the collision with the semi. That impact itself, the violence of it, the ejections, the deaths, the injuries, that's another horrific turning point, a point of no return, really.
Yeah.
Then, moving into the legal sphere, the grand jury's decision to indict him on these serious felony charges. That was a major legal turning point, setting the stage for the trial.
And finally,
the jury's verdict, finding him guilty of involuntary manslaughter, guilty of reckless conduct. That's the legal system's final determination on this chain of events.
So the verdict was guilty. What was the ultimate sentence handed down?
As we mentioned, the jury convicted him on multiple counts, including involuntary manslaughter and reckless conduct.
And the sentence reflects that severity.
It does. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a substantial term.
20 years.
And after he serves that time, He still faces 48 months. That's 4 years of probation.
Wow.
The district attorney's office commented afterwards, expressing hope, that the verdict might bring some small measure of peace or healing to the victims and their families, while acknowledging, of course, that nothing can truly undo the immense loss they've suffered.
No, absolutely not. 20 years. It really is a stark, sobering reminder, isn't it?
Yeah.
About the consequences of our choices.
Yeah.
Especially choices showing such disregard for safety. What's the biggest takeaway here? The lesson we should all absorb from this awful situation?
I think the most crucial takeaway, the fundamental point, is understanding the severe legal weight our actions carry, even if the outcome isn't what we intended at all.
The unintended consequences.
Exactly. This case is just a heartbreaking, stark example of how one single, impulsive, incredibly reckless act can unleash this devastating chain reaction. It just obliterates lives, changes everything forever for so many innocent people. It really highlights how connected we are, how much responsibility we have for the safety of others around us, just by sharing the road, sharing public space.
Yeah.
And the legal system, in cases like this, steps in to hold people accountable for that level of negligence, that disregard for life, even if there wasn't a specific intent to cause the final terrible harm.
It really does make you pause and think. It poses a difficult question, doesn't it? How far does our personal responsibility actually extend when our actions, even if they're unplanned, spur of the moment, maybe fueled by anger or intoxication, when they lead to such profound, irreversible tragedy for complete strangers?
That is precisely the heavy question this case leaves us with. It's something to really grapple with. It forces us to consider those ripple effects, the unpredictable consequences of our choices and the deep, lasting impact they can have, far beyond anything we might have imagined in the moment.
A moment of intense anger. A truly desperate act, fueled by alcohol. And then this cascade of consequences, shattered lives, irrevocably. This deep dive into the I-20 crash, it just leaves us with this really stark, chilling reminder. A reminder of how fragile life can be, especially on a busy highway, and the immense, enduring weight of the choices we make, even in our worst moments.